Normally I do these screencasts to show you how to do interesting things with WordPress and to help you build great websites. This screencast is a little bit different. Today's screencast is all about protecting your WordPress website. Now, for many of you, WordPress is an important part of your business. If your WordPress site vanished tomorrow, it would have a serious impact on your business. What we're going to talk about today is more than just backups. It's about being prepared for the worst case scenario when it happens and having a plan in place to recover from that as quickly as possible. If you're on WordPress.com, you don't need to worry. You're covered entirely. Just go on running your website, creating great content. WordPress will take care of you. But if you're self-hosting a WordPress website, you are responsible. You're on your own. You have to make sure that you've got a plan in place. You may think you're covered, but are you really? Watch this video and in a few minutes tell me how prepared you are for the worst case scenario. It's scientifically proven that bad things happen on the internet. And there's no way to see these bad things coming, but with a little bit of planning, you can be prepared to deal with those bad things to minimize the impact when they do happen. You think I may be exaggerating. I'm going to give you a few examples of some of the things that can happen to your website. This is a web server. Now, you may have a rack mount server instead of a tower server. It doesn't matter. This is a reasonable facsimile of a machine that runs as a web server in a web hosting environment. It's impressive. It's a big box with a lot of storage and memory and computing power and a really fast internet connection. But the thing about web servers is, or any other type of technology for that matter is, sometimes bad things happen. Now, your web server does not need to literally explode in order to turn your website into a lump of coal. Plenty of other things can happen and have the same impact. One big risk we're seeing today comes from hackers. Hackers can turn your website into a virtual lump of coal. Hundreds of thousands of websites are hacked every day, and that's no exaggeration. And there are many different ways that your site can be hacked. WordPress might be hacked, for example. One of the highest profile examples of that happened last summer with the Tim Thumb vulnerability. Tim Thumb is a script that happens to be used by many, many WordPress themes. Mark Monder, a WordPress programmer, discovered a vulnerability that allows hackers to take remote control of your web server. Now, Mark stepped in and provided a patch that fixed the problem in a matter of hours. In the meantime, people had sites that were hacked, and not everyone got the memo. People are still running Tim Thumb, the old version, on their website and getting hacked every day. And if WordPress isn't hacked, your web host might be hacked. Earlier this year, hackers broke into DreamHost's database and stole passwords for every single website hosted by DreamHost. But hardware failures and hackers aren't the only thing you have to worry about. Sometimes you can be your own worst enemy. Have you ever grabbed code from the internet and then pasted it into the command line without really understanding how it worked or what it was supposed to do? In this case, you would delete your WordPress database, effectively destroying your website. So the question is, when something unexpected happens, how long will it take for you to restore your website? And will that even be possible? Now, I know some of you are thinking, that's not me, I'm protected. I have a backup of my website. Good for you. But even when you have backups, there are some common problems that still present a very real risk. Here are some of the common things that can go wrong with backups. Incomplete backup. Maybe you've only backed up part of your website. Maybe you backed up the theme but didn't back up the database. Or maybe you forgot to back up your plugins and you're missing some critical functionality that your site needs to run properly. Outdated backups. When was the last time your backup was run? Can you afford to roll back to a version of your website that's 3 months old? Your backups need to be scheduled to run on a regular basis. And the frequency of those backups depends on what type of website you're running. And I'll talk about that more in a second. Missing backups. You may think you have a backup, but do you know where to find it? How long will it take to track it down? And can your site afford to be down that long? And no restoration plan. Having a backup won't do you any good if you don't know how to use it to restore your website. By now, most of you are probably thinking that you need a plan, and that's a good thing. That's exactly what I'm going to focus on for the rest of the screencast. I'm going to help you create your WordPress disaster recovery plan. I'm going to show you exactly what you need to do to ensure that your site recovers from any disaster as quickly as possible. Here's how to prepare for the worst. So the first thing you need, obviously, is a backup, and you need to make sure that it's a complete backup. WordPress is not like some of the web publishing tools you may have used in the past. Your website doesn't exist as a bunch of HTML files. Your content is stored in a database. The files you upload are stored in a special folder, and the design of your website is made up of a theme. And you may have some additional functionality that's provided by plugins, and to have a complete backup of your website, you need to back up all of those pieces. So you're going to want to start by making sure that you have a backup of the MySQL database that stores WordPress, as well as anything that's uploaded to WordPress through the administrator. Those are stored in the wp-content/uploads folder, as well as your theme, which is stored in the wp-content/themes, and then your theme will have its own folder. Now, it may be that you're using a child theme, in which case you need to back up both the parent theme and the child theme. They will be in separate folders. And you also want to back up pretty much everything in the plugins directory, wp-content/plugins, and all of the plugins that are in that folder. So the simplified version of this would be to make sure you get the WordPress MySQL database and pretty much everything under wp-content, which would cover your uploads and your themes and your plugins. Now, I list these out separately because there are some other things that end up in wp-content that you may not want to back up. For example, if you're using a caching plugin, a lot of caching plugins will store the cache in wp-content, and you don't need to back up your cache. So once you've got a good backup, then the next question is when to back up. And there's no one right answer for this. It really depends on what kind of website you're running. You have to ask yourself some questions. How frequently are you updating your website? How frequently are you adding content to your website? How much reader activity do you have? Do you have a lot of comments on your website? Or maybe you're running a special type of website where you've got a shopping cart and a membership site, or some other form of critical transactions that are going on throughout the day. So a blogger, on one hand, who posts a blog post once a week and doesn't get many comments is not going to need to back up the site every day. Probably would be able to get by with weekly database backups, and maybe even monthly full site backups, being all of the plugins and themes and everything. Whereas if you're running an active site with a community and a lot of comments and you're posting every day, you probably want to do a database backup every single day and a full backup every week. On the other hand, if you're running a web store and you've got a shopping cart and you're taking transactions, you want as many backups as you can get, because any lost activity could be lost business. So hourly backups possibly on the database, or maybe even more frequently than hourly. You really need to take a critical look at your website and ask yourself about your tolerance for lost data, and set up a regular schedule to perform backups based on that tolerance. Once you perform your backups, you need to take care of those backups. You need to store them in a safe place. Make sure that they're not on your server, for example. It doesn't make any sense to do backups and leave them on your server, and then when your server crashes, how do you get to the backups? That's no good. So you need to make sure that your backups are moved to a secure location, and you probably want to maintain multiple versions. It's possible that if there's a problem that you discover on your website, it may also be in the backup as well. You may have to go back several versions to a previous version of the backup to get to a good backup that you can use to fully restore your website. And then, of course, you need a restoration plan. You're going to need a plan for restoring your database. So you'll need to have some kind of tool that you use to connect to MySQL. Many of you will be using PHP MySQL. Your web host provides access to that. If that's the case, then you'll use that to restore the SQL script that you've been backing up. And for the files, being the upload folder and the themes and the plugins, you can use your regular FTP program. Now, this is the hard way, the manual way to do restoration. There are plugins and scripts and web services as well that will handle backups and restorations for you, and we're going to be looking at those in the next video in the series. In the meantime, it's never too early to start creating your WordPress disaster recovery plan, and I've created a worksheet to help you get started. And you can download that as a PDF file. Will be attached to the post this video is embedded in. I want to show you this worksheet quickly and explain to you how you'll fill it out. When you download the PDF file, this is what you'll get: WordPress Disaster Planning Worksheet. You should fill out one of these for every website that's important to you that runs on WordPress. Basically, the top section, you enter the site name and URL, the web host where it's hosted, And the technical contact, the name, you probably want to include the email address or phone number in case you need to get in touch with someone quickly when something goes wrong. Now, the first section after that is the backup plan. And there's a row for each of the critical components of WordPress that needs to be backed up: the database, the uploads, the themes, and the plugins. And there are some columns here. Well, the first is current backup. You want to assure that you've got a current backup for each one of these things. You also want to make a note of the backup method that you're using. Now, some options would be manual, not recommended, but that may be what you're doing. You might also be using a plugin or some sort of service, in which case just make a note of that in the column. That way, when you look at your worksheet, you'll have an idea not only that you've got a backup, but how those backups are being performed. You also want to note the frequency that you're backing up at. If you are backing up hourly or daily or monthly or weekly, make a note for each of the critical backup components, the frequency. And whether or not the backup is automated. And I will tell you that your goal is to get to having all of these being automated and going at a frequency that is appropriate for your particular website. Now, the next block down covers retention for each of the critical backup components. You want to indicate where those backups are being stored and how many versions you're maintaining. You probably want to keep 6 to 8 versions of each backup at minimum. And then the final block on this worksheet is your restoration plan for each. Now, it may be that you're using a plugin or a service, in which case you just say restore from plugin. You probably want to include the location where the plugin can be downloaded if it's lost. If you've got a service that you're using, you want to include the URL to the service so that someone can log in quickly and start the restoration process. As you start filling out worksheets for each of your important websites, I'm almost positive you're going to find some gaps where you either are not backing up everything, or you're not backing up as frequently as you should be, or you're not securing your backups. And that's the whole point of filling out a worksheet like this, is to identify where the problems are so that you can address them and have a secure backup and restoration plan going forward. And in the next video, I'm going to demonstrate a couple of different backup solutions that you can use to automate the process. The backup process, the moving your backups to a secure location process, and the restoration process. So that's coming up in the next video. In the meantime, get to those worksheets and get your disaster plan in place.